I'm Dr. Robert Ojemann, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Robert King. This is May the 2nd, 1990, and we're at the AANS meeting in Nashville, and it's a particular pleasure to interview Dr. King since he received the Cushing Medal at this meeting, the highest honor that the organization can bestow on one of its distinguished members. I thought we'd begin, Bob, by talking a little bit about your background and how you got into all this business, I guess the business of neurosurgery, and the things you're really noted for, in particular earlier in pain and research, and more recently in many aspects of education. But perhaps we could go back to the 1940s, or earlier if you'd like, and find out how all of this started and your earlier education, and why don't you take us up to how you recall as best you can you decided to go into medical school, and then we'll go from there.
Well, I think, excuse me, I think probably all of us depend heavily on mythology and trying to answer some of those questions. But my father was a distinguished scientist and teacher, and there were many teachers in the family, but no physicians at that point. And I think maybe one would have to say I moved toward medicine as a safe locus against that background. In any event, I remember it was probably late in high school that I began to look toward medicine and decided to take a pre-med course as a means of retaining many options open to me, and then was fortunate to be able to move on a 3-3 system because of the war through pre-med and medical school.
Where did you go to undergraduate?
Well, I went to Pittsburgh for 2 years, and then Michigan for a year. And
that brings us up, what, to the mid-40s?
That brings us to 43,
43,
and then went to the University of Rochester for medical school.
And graduated there?
Graduated there in 1946 because of the accelerated programs.
Right.
And, at the time, I thought medical school must be the closest thing to heaven there was, because I was absolutely having a ball no matter what field or subject I went into. And we had no grades in medical school at that time, which I know is not true now, but we literally had no grades on tests or at the beginning or end of the year or anything.
Just to pass or fail?
No, nobody failed.
Nobody failed? Well,
no, and we were told that nobody would when we went in. The dean came in, and Dr. Whipple greeted us. Lasted about 5 minutes, and we really did have an extraordinary experience. Class was small, and faculty was tight. And when I left, I found a couple of years later that I was noted to be the one in the class least likely to go into neurosurgery. I don't quite know where that came from, but didn't surprise me at the time. I thought it was rather obvious.
Well, when you did graduate, had you settled on a potential field, or were you still, I assume you went into an internship after graduation?
Well, I made the decision between medical fields and surgery, so I went to Barnes Hospital to do a general internship in surgery.
So you decided you were going to go into a surgical field?
I'd gotten that far.
Right.
Yeah. And then wound up after 14 hours on a coal stoker, window open train on the way to St. Louis in the lobby of Barnes Hospital, feeling very much out in the wilds. And started off on neurosurgery.
That was your first rotation?
About 10 minutes after I arrived. I left the bags by the information desk and went up to X-ray and looked around and saw all these people dipping X-rays in tanks and that sort of thing. Went over and sat down and talked to somebody. Motioned to me to come over, and I went down over and sat down by this very pleasant, agreeable, affable older gentleman. And as we got up to leave, I realized he started off in the beginning at the front of the line of ducks. And I picked up at the tail end, and somebody said, "Who are you?" And I told them, and I said, "Who is he?" He said, "That's Dr. Sachs. Don't you know who he is?" So that was my...
That was your introduction.
That was my introduction to neurosurgery.
Neurosurgery, and I guess one of the most senior of the neurosurgeons at that time.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
one of the early people.
Right.
So you had what, a few weeks then on neurosurgery as your first?
1 month was the
1
first
month.
rotation, and looked seriously at orthopedics and plastic surgery and other things that year. And during at that time, Dr. Schwartz became chairman of the program, or was that year. And toward the end of the year, I began to sense that a lot of the older people in practice really were not very happy in the winter months. They weren't exhausted. That's not why they really went to Florida, but they were no longer excited enough to get through the winter. And that had very little appeal to me. I couldn't quite see that, and realized that most of the people that were engaged in research and teaching were really far too excited to take winter vacations. They weren't the ones that were going. And I also had come to realize that whatever I did, because I did some research in medical school and also as an intern, whatever I did, it would have to have enough exciting research attached to the clinical work to keep as a refurbishing function, as a renewal function.
Now, back in 1946, that really wasn't the in thing, was it, to
No.
be interested in a research?
In a combined program. No, I think it was unusual, but I suppose my background may have had something to do with that. But in any event, I went to talk to Dr. Schwartz one day. He called up, got an appointment, went in to see him, and said that what I was looking for was a branch of surgery that had some very exciting research attached to it, and I thought perhaps the solution to my problem would be in neurosurgery. And so I asked him where he thought I might best go, and we talked about some places on the East Coast and elsewhere. He said, but you really ought to go over and talk to Dr. O'Leary and Dr. Bishop. Don't overlook them. And again, I was about as well informed as I was about who Dr. Sachs was when I went to St. Louis. But I went over, and as everyone knows, they're incredibly exciting people, and that's how the whole thing really fell in place. And,
so what did you do the next year then after your...
Well, then I was 18 months with them, and
in a research...
In research entirely, and incredibly exciting.
What did you work on during that time?
Well, there were a lot of people over there working together on various projects, but it was then that I think on one occasion Dr. O'Leary said, what would you like to work on? And I had been intrigued with some patients with tic-douloureux. And I said, well, you know, tic-douloureux, and then we talked about that. And I thought, it should have some electrical counterpart to it, some signature that you can measure or record or something. And he said, well, why don't you see how that system works? So along with some other projects with other people, that's the way that really began. The formal project was very interesting in the sense that Dr. O'Leary wanted me to find out where the mossy fibers came from in the cerebellum. And that involved a lot of Golgi work, et cetera, et cetera. So Henry Bramlett, who was about 6 feet tall, and the Deaners, and I would arrive at 6 in the morning and put 6-week-old babies to sleep, baby bunnies to sleep. And there was this huge man, he would intubate them, and we would make interolivary lesions and then examine them and take movies and so forth. That project was all over by 7:30 or 8 when other people arrived. That's what I was supposed to be doing that year. And that was very fun and challenging. And the rest was electrical physiology. So that's the way that began. A lot of chance events along the way.
But a real solid introduction to a
marvelous.
research career.
That's right.
From two very distinguished,
most distinguished people. Yeah.
Very fortunate to have that.
A lot of anecdotes in those few months.
Any of them you want to share with us here, or that come to mind?
Well, I think one that speaks for both Dr. O'Leary and Dr. Bishop was Sam Truffin and I were all tied up in a great big room full of loose wires and plugs and various things. Things weren't in little boxes then. And we couldn't get anything to work, and went down to see Dr. Bishop finally in desperation, and he came up and looked around. Well, one day he said, you know, why don't you plug it into the wall? But very patiently and very kindly, and we did many things equally inappropriate. Their great patience survived us in the process on many turns.
After this 18-month period of this introduction, what was the next step in your?
Well, Dr. Schwartz, I think, although I've never had it confirmed by that time, realized that I had to go back into the Army for 2 years because I'd been long delayed in that change. And so he called me back over in the clinical service for 6 months before I went to Walter Reed, which I'm sure he had something to do with.
Mm-hmm.
So then I spent 2 years there while they were.
Was this on the clinical service?
That was strictly on the clinical service. Yeah. And we had a wonderful time there. Yeah.
And you'd only had 6 months of training prior to that in neurosurgery. Plus
Yes. You're getting very close to a very sensitive question. You know, it's very difficult when a candidate comes in now looking at a 6, 7, 8, 9-year program saying, Dr. King, what was your training?
Yeah. So we're up to then about, I guess, 1950, are we?
1951.
1951.
And Dr. Risley was really our major support system at Walter Reed until George Hayes came back in the second year. Got us through many, many tight spots. But we were very active. I had a great deal of fun and enjoyed it enormously.
Was there?
Not that I was much of an Army man, but
were there several other physicians in your same sort of category with you on the service there, or were you alone?
I was well, there were two of us, essentially, and then a group of people rotating.
And then your consultants, such as Dr. Risley.
Dr. Risley and Dr. Watts were the two major ones.
Right.
Riz would come out any time, day and night, and hold our hands as we got around a stiff corner or something. He was marvelous.
I'm sure he's a marvelous person.
Yes.
Then did you go back to St. Louis then?
Then I went back to St. Louis as a Markle Scholar, so they had to put me on staff, which was
and that,
another
the Markle
fortunate
Scholars,
turn.
I recall, were 5-year.
Those were 5 years.
For people who wanted to go into a academic
yes,
research.
who wanted to work out an academic track. And that's the year we were married.
Well, I was going to come to that a little later, but to lovely wife, Molly, for those of you that don't know her.
Yeah.
And you met her
Well, I
in
met
St.
her
Louis?
when I was in medical school.
When you were in medical school.
Yeah. Her family used to have a bunch of these uniformed guys that were in medical school over to have dinner at their family on holidays and so forth. And so Molly and I got to know each other way back when.
And she stuck around until you were all ready after.
Well, when it finally came to fruition, things moved very rapidly.
Very rapidly. Yeah. You're very fortunate. She's a lovely lady.
You bet.
We've enjoyed knowing her. Now, so you started on the staff in St. Louis, having had 18 months of research, 6 months of residency,
This
and 2
is
years.
the first time this has ever been recorded. and 2 years in the Army.
For someone who is so involved in education, that'll be of interest. And 2 years in the Army. Yeah. And so you're back with, now who was there at that time when Dr. Schwartz was the chief?
Dr. Schwartz was chief, and Dr. Winokur was chief resident, and Sid Goldring was there, and Bill Collins came out as a student on a rotation.
My goodness, what an array.
And Bill Hunt was there, Lou Schricker, and Griff Harsh, Hal Paxton, that kind of crowd.
Well, that's quite a.
That's when the St. Louis Mafia got formed.
Yes. Well, now, what were your assignments or your activities during this time as you started back in St. Louis on this Markle fellowship?
I got back into the laboratory on some additional research, extending things that we'd been doing. And
still working on the trigeminal.
But out there you never worked on one thing. Everybody sort of worked in a poly-team kind of a function. It was great. You could work on a number of things. But we started that up again. And but that was only for a 1-year slot, because then the next year we were able to go to Queen Square for a year.
Oh.
So Molly and I spent a year over there.
Is that something that you had planned, or it came up at the last minute, or is
No,
it-
that was planned into the Markle sequence
and
so that I could have a
what
year
was
of neurology.
the reason for that? To
Well, I
get
wanted
neurology?
I wanted
or-
to learn neurology.
Neurology.
Because it seemed to me the kind of things the British published, you really had a hard time understanding how they generated that kind of information from the general tone of American publications. So I wanted to go over and find out how they did that, because it looked to me as though their clinical observations had to be extraordinarily astute and careful, and the process seemed to me somehow different. And I wanted to see if I could get an understanding of what that process was. So that's the reason.
Well, that must have been an interesting year.
Then we also had time on neuropathology while we were there. Oh, we had a marvelous year, spectacular year.
And it met your expectations,
Oh,
did it?
absolutely. I spent most of the time with Sir Charles Simons, which of course was a great privilege, enormous privilege.
Well, you must have been well schooled in neurology after that period of time.
I hope so.
So that was a year then,
Yeah.
spent there, and back to St. Louis then?
Back to St. Louis for another 4 years, and then we went on to Syracuse.
And during that 4 years, you did clinical work as well as continuing your laboratory?
And we had students on the medical students on the program all the time during that period too, so we tried to keep them
You were
active.
involved in teaching them as well?
Right.
So that would bring us then to about 1957, I guess. And you made the move to
Syracuse that year.
Was that, had you looked at to become a chief of a service, or you had thought maybe you'd just stay in St. Louis, or what were your thoughts? How did that come about?
Not an easy question to know an answer to. I really didn't have any intention to leave. The Markle Scholar support was winding up, but the indications were that I could stay, and I was certainly planning to stay.
They even promoted you, as I noticed in your CV, from assistant to associate professor at about that
the same time. And but I think I had a sense that I wanted to, if I saw an opportunity to, I could maybe in a smaller environment than Washington University, develop a new pattern or a different pattern of training, of graduate training for residents in neurosurgery.
Use some of your own ideas to...
And I think since there was no program in Syracuse, and that perhaps I thought that might be a fertile field to try some different things.
And you could kind of start things from the beginning without...
And I thought, in any event, perhaps it would be possible to make a contribution to a new medical school, and not new in the historic sense, but new in the sense that it was rolling over to full-time faculty and research programs in the clinical fields with very little background in that setting, and it was also a public school. And I remember sensing that the public medical schools probably had an important contribution, particularly that even at that time, tuition and things were moving rather rapidly upscale in the private schools.
So the move then occurred in '57 to Syracuse, and you became the professor of neurosurgery there and chairman of that. Was it a division or department?
It was a division of
Division of
surgery
surgery.
initially. Right.
But it became a department
About 10 years later.
10 years later. Was it a hard road to get that program established, or?
Well, it was very exciting. I don't know what hard is necessarily, but it was a very, very exciting time. It didn't work out the way we had thought it would. But
what had your plans been then?
Well, initially we thought we'd have them go into the laboratory a year initially to learn more about what it meant to do research and what skills were required.
Along
and so
the
forth.
ideas you'd had.
That's right,
your own
but on a somewhat
background.
more extended form. And then we set up a 2-year program that would be available, expected maybe every fourth or fifth or sixth year someone would come along that might want to do it in 2 years, because we had the feeling, with support from our, people in St. Louis and others, that you really can't do that unless you're going to give it 2 years. The surprise came when the applicants all said they wanted the 2-year program.
To get a good solid block
to get a really solid block in it. It was a little different program than the other one, with more independence and more of a graduate school atmosphere to it.
Some of them might even get a degree
Yes.
during that time.
And with much more freedom and self-pacing and self-determination, but with a lot of faculty push. And they chose that one so regularly that within 2 years we couldn't make any one-year appointments. And that came as a big surprise. That I had not anticipated. I don't think any of us had.
But you should have been happy.
Oh, it was wonderful. It made it very
fit right
exciting.
in with your.
Made it very exciting. That's right. And it's continued to
And
be.
you continued that during the. So the structure, that 2 years was at the beginning or
At the very
middle
beginning.
or very beginning?
And one's biases are pretty much set on your own prejudices, and my prejudice was essentially, granted it could be done many other ways, but my bias had been generated that if the more you know about how the nervous system is thought to function, the better you can understand a sick one. And if you can understand what's going wrong with a patient in that context, you can take better care of them. You can certainly understand perhaps more clearly what's going wrong. And that makes the clinical care vastly more exciting, and feeds that, so that the two began to feed back and forth on each other very, very quickly. And I'm not quite sure where that came from, but that was persuasion, and I've always admitted it freely as a bias.
Well,
But that was the bias that made that kind of a program so exciting. And it seemed, at least, of course one sees and hears what one chooses to, but or is tuned to, but it seemed that the residents who understood that and took major advantage of it were asking a very different kind of question when they came out onto the clinical service. One thing that's over time, it's also came as a surprise, is that they're much more comfortable with uncertainty. They really handle it with much more security.
really become part of their
becomes
day-to-day,
part of their modus operandi, and they're comfortable, and they
Right.
transmit that comfort to the patients in discussing the uncertainties, the unknowns in medicine, and they can do it with self-confidence and assurance. And I think that's been a very big payoff in the art of medicine and how they relate, but I think that's where it comes from.
So over the years, then, I would surmise that the training of the resident and the resident having this research background was very gratifying and really probably one of the things that most satisfying to you to
Oh, I
see
think there's no question about it. No question about it. We all got together last night, as a matter of fact, and had another big family gathering. And I think that's been the most rewarding part of the last 30 years, without any question, is to see what's come of these young people and how they've responded in that kind of circumstance, because many of them never been in a laboratory before. I mean, never literally been in one, and they're almost afraid to turn a machine on because they think they'll blow it up. They get lost in the first 3 to 6 months, but then the momentum picks up, and they begin to see that from their own resources, which comes as a surprise to many of them. They come up with very new and creative insights and notions, and pretty soon they get on a roll when they simply can't handle all the new things that are bursting from them. That becomes very exciting to them.
And the way you have structured this to give them this confidence, even those that eventually decide that an academic career is not for them but go into practice, certainly benefit greatly from having had that background in the care of their patients.
I think that in general that's true of almost all of them. And many of them either will tell me, but I don't know how to evaluate that, but I'll hear them having told others that those were the most important 2 years of my training. in the sense that it changed the way I did medicine in the next 3 to 4 or 5 years. And it's kept me aware of the difficulties of research, how much time it takes, why it moves so slowly, and what has to be accomplished to have it translated into clinical practice in a reasonable and secure way. And it's kept me wanting to stay abreast at least of some of the basic research that's going on feeding into medicine.
That's
Well,
what
it's changed a lot of them in many, many ways. And that's
very
terribly exciting.
gratifying, very exciting, and also keeps you up to date.
You bet. You bet.
Or at least trying to keep up
Trying
to date.
hard to.
Or trying
That's
hard
right.
to keep up to date.
You can't quite manage it, but you try.
Well, certainly, I think there's no question that your foresight and your residency program and these ideas were certainly at the forefront of what now a large number of programs have undertaken, namely a significant block of research time as part of the overall training program. And I don't know who might have been the first, the earliest, but certainly you were in the forefront there. I think there's no
Well, of
question
course,
about that.
we had a preset from St. Louis.
Right.
Because when Dr. Schwartz would let us go over there, he took hands off, and O'Leary and Bishop took us over. I'm sure that set a pattern in mind.
Washington University certainly is known for that.
That's right. It wasn't a formal 2 years. It was the time was different and so forth.
Right.
So putting it in as an upfront block time was what I wanted to see, what difference that would make.
Well, now during this time, it sounds like that's a full-time job in itself, was training the neurosurgeon and taking care of some patients, but you also continued some of your research activities, and there was a steady stream of publications over the years that related to primarily, I think, pain remained your investigative interest. Is that
primarily?
Correct?
That's right.
And with particular interest in the trigeminal system.
Particularly in the laboratory work, that's
Right.
true.
Now, as the time went along, you were asked to do a number of things for the medical school as well, and chair a number of search committees, help with a number of different activities in the school. And looking over your CV, it looked like you almost had a full-time job doing those things as well.
Well, they have to be done to keep the engine rolling.
Yeah. And also at the same time, you were becoming more and more involved in the national neurosurgical organizations and those organizations that related to medical education in general. And I guess that, well, beginning, I think, when was it, in the early to mid-'70s, you became a member of the American Board of Neurosurgery, and you were the secretary for several years, which really the secretary runs that board, and then were chairman of the American Board of Neurosurgery. And then sort of in concert with that, you started to become involved with the various organizations that relate to the American Board of Medical Specialties. Now, maybe you can give us a little background as to what the chronology of that was and how your interest developed in that aspect of education.
Well, actually, I think it had its early phase in the AANS Education Committee, in which one of the subcommittees was graduate medical education and became concerned about the requirements vis-a-vis both certification and accreditation. And a task force was formed, and we submitted our observations to the board, which was not entirely open to suggestion from outside organizations. And so
It was known at that time as a rather refractory organization.
Actually, there had been no major revisions of the board requirements or the RRC requirements since 15 or 18 years before that. but that's what led to a general turmoil to the concern that it be, see what could be done to readjust it. But they set up this task force with...
Within the AANS to...
No, the Education Committee did this on its own
initiative.
And took the issue to the board.
Board.
And then the board set up a task force on education with Bill
Okay.
Meacham as chairman, and then put us in charge of graduate education. And then that's when these final things came in. So I really never expected to hear from the board again after we went through that phase. But, you know, they turned around and asked me to come on the board. And that was, to me, a very, very rewarding experience. I am sure that I had never worked with a group of people so independent of their source of origin and from such a wide variety of backgrounds, who worked so diligently and so hard and openly in almost in a clean, apolitical atmosphere toward the goals of the board. It was a very, very rewarding time. And it was during that time that I got onto asked to be on the RRC for a time as secretary of the board, which was kind of automatic then.
Right.
And then from the RRC and the ABMS onto the ACGME.
Okay, you came to the ABMS through the RRC or through the board?
Through the board and onto the RRC also.
And then
from the ABMS, from the ABMS onto the ACGME.
Okay. For those that might not be familiar with all these acronyms, why don't you indicate what?
The RRC is the Residency Review Committee, of
right.
course, and the ABMS is the American Board of Medical Specialties,
Right.
which is a federation of the 23 specialty boards,
Mm-hmm.
which has a remarkable history in itself. And then the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education is the one that oversees all the graduate medical education programs from the point of view of the program, as opposed to the boards which oversee the specialties from the point of view of certifying individuals. So it began to run a parallel track.
But you were getting more and more involved and in several avenues of those aspects of education or organizations that relate to education or
Yes.
graduate education.
At least in the private sector.
Correct. Then, as time went along, and you were chairman of the board, and for 2 years, I believe, and that's a busy time in itself. And at the same time, then you were doing some other things with the ABMS. And also, I think during that time, which I guess is the late 70s now, you were president of the Senior Society, and that is, this, for those who are not familiar, is the society that really includes the vast majority of program directors and is interested in primarily in the resident education and all things related to that. And you had some ideas at that time, I guess in your presidential address, that didn't go too far, I think you.
Oh, well,
told me.
you know, not every egg hatches.
What were you trying to propose at that point in time?
I had said, I remember saying something in that about the fact that if they would all get together, you know, it would only cost them $400 a year or something like that to put together a fund to support research for trainees and
Right.
in their programs and that sort of thing. And that's just about as far as that went. On the other hand, it was during that time that we were presenting for their approval the changes in training program accreditation. So there are a lot of things going on.
The special requirements were being altered.
This was the
really
task force making their
yes.
recommendations to feed into the Residency Review Committee.
Right.
So by the time they got to the Residency Review Committee or the board, this group of people had already given their affirmation on 2 occasions. So there was a lot of other things bubbling along at that time, too.
But during that time, there were a lot of really important changes made in those requirements that were eventually approved.
Right.
And that was, I think, very important for the future of neurosurgery.
And the slowdown, it took a long time. It took about 7 years, but the slowdown was not within neurosurgery. It really went very, very forward at a very purposeful pace in neurosurgery. The larger structure was where it slowed up.
And the bureaucracy of the
ACGME and the RRCs and so forth.
But eventually
that all got cleared.
During this time, you also, because of, I'm sure, all of these activities, became involved with the organizational structure of this organization, the American Association of Neurologic Surgeons, AANS, and I believe it was 1981 you were president of this organization. And during your presidency and in relation to that, you had what many of us consider one of the foremost and most important ideas that has come along for national neurosurgery, namely the formation of a research foundation under the aegis of the national organization. Now, I guess none of us really know how that all started. I remember the board approving a concept, and then as more developed purpose and regulations, all those things. But somewhere it had to start. And
well, not many people do know. I don't know where
you're considered the father of that organization, and how did you come up with that idea?
I've indicated my interest in research and its relationship to clinical medicine.
All the way back to 1946.
And it was clear and generally recognized that there are very few neurosurgeons actively doing neurosurgery as a part of their ongoing career, and that their support from the usual resource pools of financing in NIH and so forth really wasn't a very stunning representation. They really weren't competitive in the research market. And this had always bothered many, many people. And all right, I'll tell you the story. I told him the story before we got on tape anyway.
Well, I always think it's interesting how things come about. I think it's good for people.
I remember one morning I was shaving the right cheek, and I was fussing about this business, about the research base in neurosurgery and what was being done about it and not done about it and so on. And I was becoming more and more agitated as I was shaving, and suddenly I realized I was looking at a very angry face in the mirror, but then realized, and it came to me, what are you yelling at him for? He'd better go out and do something. That's literally when it began to hatch. And I began putting down little notes and little notions as to how and where, and realizing nothing had happened when I dropped that hint to the Senior Society. That's not the way to go. And so that's where it came from. But with obviously an enormous number of people involved.
Well, no question about that, but it's always interesting to look back at how an important idea originated.
Well, that's the way that would happen. That was the starting point.
Well, that
anyway.
clearly has gone on, and you've been chairman of that since its inception, that foundation, and it now has reached over $2 million in an endowment, and is supporting not only young investigators during their training, but also the investigator who is starting the career, just like you did with the Markle Fellowship, but with a support during their first couple of years in an academic position to get themselves started. And I guess what now, a total each year of 4 or 5 being supported. I'm realizing they're on a 2-year.
Some are on a 2-year program. We'd like to get them all onto a 2-year program. So we're funding about 5 a year, with an overlap of those from the preceding that had 2 years, appointing either 2 or 3 new ones a year. And they set a remarkable track record.
I think that really summarizes it well. It's really filled a need, And, well, one only has to look at the number of people applying for this relatively limited number of positions and high-quality application. In fact, my understanding is it's very hard to judge several very closely competing applications.
Now, the Scientific Advisory Committee is really the engine that drives the whole program, and they include a little more than 50% of them are not neurosurgeons, and we plan to keep the Scientific Advisory Committee balanced in that fashion so as to keep a good representation of the many disciplines that emerge in the course of these reviews. But even in addition to that, we've had to use as many as 6 external reviewers a year in order to have real expertise in reviewing these applications and getting a good quality judgment. But we could be funding twice as many who fall in the very highest.
They would all have very high scores.
All have exceedingly high scores, yeah. And you know, you can't refine that kind of a judgment call precisely. So we're still having to limit it to the very top of that stack.
Now, during this same time frame, your peers have seen fit to elevate you to the presidency of the ABMS, American Board of Medical Specialists, which, as you indicated earlier, is the umbrella organization for, what is it, 23?
23 boards.
Boards, the official boards. In that position, you really have a unique opportunity to relate to some very important problems that face us in education, and in particular, the 2 areas of specialization and subspecialization and of recertification. I'd like to have the benefit of your current views. Let's start out with subspecialization and the problems related to that aspect of things.
That's a very, very difficult one, I think. Let me backtrack and suggest that the problem began about the turn of the century when medicine began to attach itself to science. And anything that attaches itself to science has to expect differentiation, because that's exactly what science does. And that crept into medicine at about that same time. That's when most of the specialty societies began to form, because as a group of people develop a common interest in a particular vein, they tend to cluster to talk about their common concerns.
Right.
They want to get together. And as this differentiation function has continued throughout the last 80 years, it's spawned more and more specialty practicing groups, and then they want recognition, quite obviously. So that forms not only specialty societies, but specialty boards. And then as that differentiation process continues, all of those specialties begin to subspecialize. And those that subspecialize once more. So that at the present time, the 23 boards are issuing a total of about 91 or 2 certificates, including the subspecialties that they do certify. Many subspecialty areas that they don't even start to certify yet that are all clamoring. There's about 15 in the pipeline now coming in for additional certificates of one kind or another. Even a move to having accreditation of a training program without certification. Without certification. So that exponential growth, I think, is absolutely intrinsic to anything that's bonded over to science. And as long as we keep that bonding, we have to find a better way to deal with that kind of differentiation. Some people are concerned about fragmentation, particularly in a small body of people like in neurosurgery. They're worried about fragmentation, and that's putting a damp on it to a considerable extent. But I don't see it as necessarily fragmenting anything. I think it can be done in such a way that it can bond more tightly those whose specialties and special expertise are clearly recognized within that community. One of the problems, however, and we've already alluded to it indirectly when we talked about my 6 months at Barnes and 2 in the Army, has to do with training, because you can't continue to add a year for one subspecialty training and 2 years for other special credentials and another one for this and another one for that. You'll keep people in training all their lives.
We're already have a long training.
Neurosurgeons don't get out of formal training for the most part till they're somewhere between 32 and 36 as it is, and that's ridiculous. So the question is, to my mind, how can it be built back into the training programs and still come up with this kind of, with a response to this kind of need? And I think it can probably be done. It could be done, for instance, by different utilization of the 21 months of elective time that we already have even in our current programs. About 60% of our programs now are at 6 years instead of 5. So that really gives another 24 months.
But they're using a lot of that for
for this sort of thing.
Well, or for research.
And also for research, which is another kind of differentiation.
Right.
The question is, can some of that formal training program within a fixed program that gets a primary certificate be adjusted so that an emphasis in time can be given to a field that somebody has particular interest in, and then allow that to appear on that primary certificate
As a sub-area of interest.
As an area of special interest. So then he has this piece of paper that's important in the practice of neurosurgery, at least in many hospital appointments and things like that, at least people perceive that it is, without adding formal time to training and without adding an overlay of multiple certification processes. I think for the most part that can be built in without getting involved in this post-training fellowship program, which is beginning to be extraordinarily expensive. The cost of the board system and the accreditation system for training program is extraordinary. It's $70 or $80 million a year, and you can't let that continue to escalate.
Can't really add to that to any great degree.
And that's just the management cost. I'm not talking about house staff salaries or anything like that. That's an organizational cost. You can't just let that keep going up, and you can't keep adding time onto training requirements to be responsive to this inevitable differentiation that goes on in something like neurosurgery, which is expanding so fast into the future that it's, I think we have to try to catch it early and bring it back into some kind of constraint and build this need into a new set of special requirements now for neurosurgery that recognizes this need.
Now, would you allow a resident, say, in your program who had a particular interest in something that your program, while it had some basic interest in, didn't have a special interest in, go to another program for
Absolutely.
6 months or a year out of that training?
Absolutely, and we do that. And they've gone to a variety of institutions. They've always gone, well, always, they've for many, many years gone to Rochester for their 6 months of neurology. They've gone to at least 5 other institutions in the United States and Canada for 3 to 6 months block time for special training in areas of particular interest to them.
Right.
And we have always in the program, as a matter of fact, told them that if at the end of the program they wanted to do something else of consequence for 3 to 6 months, we would continue their salaries, even though they'd finished their formal training, so that they could go and do it. And they've gone to Zurich for research, and they've gone to Queen Square, they've gone to a variety of places in this country and Canada on that basis. They don't all choose to, but many, many have.
So
But now we're trying to build that back into the training period of time.
And that we should, your thought is to foster more of the planning of this, and as part of that elective or
Well, yeah, exactly.
time within the
program. It makes scheduling problems, but I think those are mechanical. I don't see that's any reason not to solve a mechanical problem. I think it can be done without adding time, certainly without adding very much. And then, but the big advantage of it is that then you don't get into a set of competing fellowship programs that are bouncing around, some of them accredited, some of them not accredited, some of them transdisciplinary, with multiple disciplines involved, but you can build that into a training program too. The biggest barrier that I see at the moment in that regard is that the specialties and the 23 primary boards all expect to maintain indefinitely their absolute autonomy and authority, and they're going to have to learn to share that. They're going to have to learn to share resources in the training centers in terms of faculty, space, laboratory resources, time, money, salaries. How staff support systems are falling down in terms of their dollar support. So those resources are going to have to be recoalesced and reintegrated, and training programs in multiple disciplines, at least more than one discipline, may in part have to become amalgamated so as to take maximum use of those limited resources. And of course, the one absolute limited resource is time. And in order to deal with that one efficiently, I think we have to take a very hard look at packaging them differently to deal with this major problem.
Well, that's a tall order.
There's no point in starting with a little one,
Right.
because I think it's a tall problem.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to have that kind of something like that open approach, sharing authority and resources in order to get ahead of it.
Now, to become a board-certified neurosurgeon, one has to pass a written examination either during the training or within a 5-year period thereafter, and also pass an oral examination sometime after 2 years of training. Now, are you comfortable with this certification process? Do you think that it should or will be altered? Should the oral exam be given right at the end of residency? Should this whole structure be changed in some way? Is the written examination really a measure of what one is trying to measure with it? You've been very close to those.
I'm not comfortable with it because I think that system is being asked to do something it's really not prepared to do and can't do. I say that in the context that it lacks predictive validity with respect to someone's performance in practice. Well, competence is a tough term for me to handle,
right.
But the quality assurance element is not predictable when somebody moves from one environment to the next. The SATs are not a good predictor of performance necessarily in college. The MCATs aren't either. As you come into medical school, the predictive validities of those kinds of testing simply has never worked out, at least to my mind, to a satisfactory level. Averages are one thing, but averages, I think, is not looking at enough. I think we need to try to boost the average performance, but we have to be very careful to look at the outliers at the bottom of the pile who really aren't performing in the context of quality assurance at a level that's very satisfactory to the rest of their peers. So I have come to sense a different way of looking at what you've just outlined, and I would think that that should be looked at as graduate medical education. It's very much like graduate medical education. We give written examinations, oral examinations, laboratory experience, practice time, teaching time, and all the rest of it. And if you change the names a little, it's exactly the same. Then you even have an oral thesis defense at the end. Then we have an oral examination at the end, which I do think can evaluate qualities not well tailored to other instruments like a written exam, which is great for cognitive information. But essentially, that's a curriculum that's been completed. Right. So, and we give a certificate, but we call them diplomats. So I'm thinking that we might consider calling that a diploma, and that they've essentially graduated from a curriculum that's been established by the boards and the RRCs. Mm-hmm. And don't talk about anything that's of a predictive nature at that time regarding practice. Although they've had 2 years of reasonably satisfactory practice up to that time, that's still a shop time. That's an early time. Mm-hmm. And during a practitioner's lifetime in any field, basically their practice pattern changes over time. Their skills change over time, their practice patterns change over time, and the definition of a specialty becomes almost impossible under that circumstance because many factors other than training change that practice pattern. My own persuasion is, since we don't have good predictive validity, we should look at outcome of the performance of the practice in the context of quality assurance. And I'm much more comfortable with the profession doing that than some outside agency doing that and setting the criteria.
No question about that.
So although I can't say that I've had any great success with some of the boards that are apprehensive about recertification, which is the current term, I think the day is coming, and I just hope that the boards get there ahead of other people in terms of setting up those processes.
Before it's legislated.
Well, we're very close to that in New York. Now,
Yeah.
you're almost as close in Massachusetts. But I think there are ways now, economically feasible, sufficiently predictable, that look at process to some extent, but certainly have to look at outcome criteria to at least find the outliers and then feed them back into a re-education process. They don't flunk or pass, but at a certain level, they qualify to re-enter a formal extension, education, postgraduate, continuing education kind of process that's tailored to the kind of practice they're doing. By the time some people have been in practice 15 years, they're doing almost nothing but spine work or other things. I know one, world famous cardiac surgeon, for instance, that no longer does anything but valves and triple bypasses. Well, it's ridiculous to ask him to be recertified in everything that's involved in thoracic surgery. His results are superb. And I think that's the critical issue. If the practice outcome is superb, there's no problem. But if it falls far short of the mark, it needs to be re-nurtured and re-energized and brought back up to a satisfactory level of performance. And that, to my mind, is where certification and recertification should enter the process. So the first time out into practice, having already been graduated from that graduate school training program, that's when you get your first certificate. You already got your diploma. The first certificate certifies the quality of the practice. And then that's redone at whatever time interval seems appropriate, presumably different from one area to another, and let that continue on then until someone no longer is practicing. But it's not pejorative. It doesn't have anything to do with the first diploma. It's simply a way of re-entering a renewal process to upgrade one's practice if there appear to be some slippage in the system. And I think as a consequence, we'll raise the average output of the profession in addition to that in terms of quality assurance. So I think it'll deal both with the average level of performance as well as finding the outliers that are really having trouble.
Well, that's...
So I see that for the next 10 or 15 years.
That's a very, I think, important discussion of really what is a problem that we're going to be facing very...
I think those two problems, the problem that's generated by differentiation and the problem of assuring quality and continuing practice, are two of the very big problems that medicine must put their teeth into and take the lead in.
Well, now you have received many honors. We've already referred to receiving the Cushing Medal at this meeting of the organization. Your university has seen fit to make you a distinguished university professor, which my understanding is very few people receive that important designation, and allows you to carry on activities as you see fit in your chosen field. And we're all congratulate you on that
Thank you.
aspect. In closing, is there anything further that you'd like to say about neurosurgery as you see it going into this 1990 decade of the brain and then on into the 21st century?
Well, I think I know some people get distressed by the turbulence that's in the system right now in terms of social forces and political forces and economic forces and so forth. And it's a turbulent time. It would be foolish not to recognize it. But nevertheless, I think there are more than ample resources in neurosurgery and available to it. And it maintains still a leadership posture within the rest of medicine, which is very remarkable for the relatively small numbers that there are in neurosurgery. in part, I think, driven by a field that's expanding at an extraordinary rate. And with the neurosciences expanding the way they are, the research base that's going to feed new opportunities into neurosurgery is almost
broad.
frightening. It's just almost more than you can imagine neurosurgical community staying ahead of. The wave is just going to be extraordinary. So far as neurosurgery is concerned, I can't think of a more exciting place to be for the next X number of years. I don't see any limit to it. It's going to change pattern. You know, it's not all bad that we don't do pneumos anymore. They were marvelous when they came in, but it's awfully good to have them behind us. And a lot of what we're doing today we'll put behind us, I'm sure.
For the
But
better.
that just
for the
makes
better.
it more
Yes.
and more exciting
Yes.
and more of an opportunity to do more than you ever dreamed could be done in terms of patient care and nurturing the things that most of us went into medicine in the hopes that we might be able to nurture. So I'm extraordinarily optimistic about the future. I don't even put it in those terms. I just hope we can keep up with the call, because the call is going to be just extraordinary for our responsiveness.
Well, as you said, that's what makes neurosurgery exciting and
Just
challenging.
extraordinary.
It's a great specialty.
And we gain from what everybody else puts into it.
Bob, it's been a real pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to you today, to find out how some of the very important things in neurosurgery got started, and particularly to hear about your background and your thoughts as they relate to the future and the education of the neurosurgeon. Thank you again.
Thank you.